Well, good evening, everybody. Have you ever heard of the concept of world weariness? So, world weariness is the idea of feeling or indicating feelings of weariness, tiredness, boredom, or cynicism as a result of experiences in life. You're just sick of the world. And dealing with the world and its problems, it can make you tired, it can make you angry, it can make you anxious. And I have to admit that I fight this a lot. I just want to sometimes give up. Like, do I really have to put up with all this stuff? There's so many things going on. The brokenness of the world, human problems, life stresses, they get to me, and then sometimes I just don't want to do it anymore. And I think, can I just take my family and find some beach or some cabin somewhere where there's nobody else and we don't have any of these problems? But we are in this world, and our experiences are intertwined with it, good and bad. And sometimes we can wonder, we can sit here and think, what are we waiting for? What is it exactly that we're doing here? What's the plan? And there's a good amount of teaching of that in Scripture. And tonight I want to look at one of Jesus' parables that addresses some of this, and that is the parable of the weeds, or traditionally the parable of the tares. So only Matthew includes this parable. And if you look at the context, this is going to be Matthew 13. I encourage you all to turn there. Matthew 13, and you look at this, Jesus talks in sort of a chunk of parables. And the parables around it describe situations that would happen as response and then growth based on Jesus' teaching. So you have the familiar parable of the sower. You have the mustard seed and the leaven, things like this, demonstrating what was going to be some of the outcomes and situations after Jesus started preaching his messages. And so really the parable of the weeds shows that there is going to be this period of time when the children of the kingdom are going to coexist with the children of evil. And that there needs to be patience until the time when all is revealed and the harvest comes and the groups are separated. And so the big idea here is that Jesus teaches that there will be a time in the future when people will be divided into two groups for judgment and for salvation, and that the people of the kingdom have to patiently await this day. So let's get into that. The parable of the tares. So this first section where Jesus actually tells the parable is what Andrew read for us a minute ago. We won't read that again. But a summary of this is that a man plants a field with seed, but when the plants start growing, it's apparent that there's some other stuff in there that doesn't belong. There's bad weeds mixed in with it. And so it's come to the conclusion that an enemy has sabotaged the crop. So instead of trying to pull out the weeds now and risking harm to the crop, the master says, let's wait until the harvest, and then when the plants are old enough and we can pull them all out, then we can separate them, and the crops can be stored and the weeds could be burned. And this was a part of everyday life for them. Jesus often used agricultural analogies to teach because that was common understanding to them. They were all either involved in growing their own food or they knew someone directly who did that. But that's not necessarily our situation today. And so it can be a little difficult for some of us to understand. So entertain, I guess, maybe a possible but a possibly bad contemporary illustration. Think of the social media landscape today. You're sitting on your phone or you're sitting on your desktop or whatever it is and you're scrolling. And that alone can cause world weariness as you just see all of these things flashing before your eyes. You're scrolling through and you see happy memories and you see anniversaries, you see inspirational quotes, but then there is this just unending deluge of filth and of negativity and all of these things mixed in with that. So just like the tares among the wheat, the platforms, they're filled with both that good and that bad. And we can't really control this, but maybe we wish that there would be some time in the future where the powers that be would go through and they'd filter all of these things to where you can separate it and see this is clearly a bad thing, this is clearly a good thing, and we don't have to worry about encountering all of that. So maybe that works, maybe that doesn't. You'll have to let me know. But going back to the parable here, the key event is that an enemy has sabotaged the crop, resulting in a mix of weeds and desirables that can't be addressed right now because of fear for ruining the desirable plants. If you've been a Christian for any amount of time, you probably know where some of this is going, but if you were to encounter this story for the first time and left without explanation, it's not exactly clear where this is going. It's an interesting story, and that vagueness leads to the disciples later privately asking Jesus to explain what this meant, as they did often. And so then that gets us to the second part, after a little bit of break in Matthew chapter 13. In verse 36, they come into the house, and they said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." That's a neat story. It's a little bit of a weird situation. What does this mean? So Jesus provides us first with the keys for interpreting this parable, and then he also gives us the meaning of it. So he gives these analogs of this means this means this, and this is the key for interpreting the message of the parable. And so it reads in verses 36 through 39, "He left the crowds, he went into the house, and they asked, 'Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field.' And he answered, 'The one who sows good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels.'" Pretty simple, right? This means this, that means that. But then when you start thinking about these things, it gets a little bit more complicated maybe. But I think it's helpful to group this up into similar parts to see how it relates. So I want to talk about this in terms of the characters or the sower and the seed, and then we'll talk about the field and the harvest or the events. So we'll talk about the characters and then the events. So if you look at these verses, Jesus tells us first, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. Son of Man being the title that Jesus used for himself for a lot of reasons. But Jesus is the one planting the seed in the field. Then he says the good seed is the children of the kingdom. The good seed that Jesus is planting are the people who respond to his message of the kingdom and that belong to him. And so he plants them. They're part of him. He says the enemy, the one who sabotages, is the devil. The devil tries to sabotage the crop of good seed that Jesus has planted. And so he intentionally places evil things there. And I want to take a minute to talk about this idea of the seed. So the word that is used, the plant that's referred to here, is the weed. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. Darnel. I had never heard of that before. Apparently it's a common thing in those who grow wheat. But it's basically identical looking to wheat in the growing stages. You can't really tell the difference from it at first. And so they can grow up together and you don't know it's there. Hey, bud. They grow up together and you can't tell it's there, but if it's ingested, it's actually a little bit poisonous and can cause quite a bit of sickness. And so the problem is, if you don't separate them, it spoils your whole crop and it can cause sickness. So the plants were basically identical until maturity, and that's where this parable picks up, where the servants say, "Where did these things come from? Did you use bad seed?" And so the children of the kingdom and the children of the devil are all mixed up, and they're coexisting. And what is there to do at this point? But then that's the characters, the seed, the sowers, and the things that are happening there. But in addition to that are the environment and the events. And so we're told here that the field is the world or the kingdom. And maybe you've heard this before. There's a strong tradition and a tendency to say that the field here is the church, because it's often said the church is the kingdom and so forth and so on. But I want to look at a couple of problems with that view. For one, this would make the parable about Satan successfully placing false disciples in the church, which would be problematic. Only God has that control. But second, I think more importantly, if we try to equate the field with the church, then we make Jesus contradict himself in this parable. So look, for instance, at verse 38, where Jesus says explicitly, the field is the world. He does not say the field is the church. He says the field is the world. And later on then, it perhaps gets a little confusing because in verse 41, Jesus sends the harvesters to collect the people out of his kingdom, and we usually think of that as the church. But because of what Jesus has already said, that's not what's going on. He says, the Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers. So the harvest isn't happening out of the church. The harvest is happening out of the field, the world, which is all still under the rule of the king. And so the idea of kingdom that's being used here is just that concept of the rule of the king. Anywhere that is under his authority, and Jesus rules over the world. So the field, the kingdom, in this parable is the world, where the people of the kingdom coexist and they're mixed in with others. So you have the people of the kingdom, the people of the evil one, and the people of the kingdom are those that have accepted, well, let me back up for a second. Those of the kingdom or of the evil one are those who have accepted the rule of either one in which they live. So the people of the evil one have accepted the rule of the evil one. The people of the kingdom have accepted the rule of the king. And so then let's put that together. So what we have is Jesus, the sower, planting seed, the people of the kingdom, in the field, which is the world. But the enemy, Satan, also plants people in the world who are people that do not submit to the kingdom, but instead they are characterized by the fact that they follow the enemy. So this is talking about more than the church here. So moving on from those things are the events. And so the events here is obviously the harvest. And Jesus says that the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. So the harvest is the end of the age where the reapers, or the angels, the harvesters, gather the good and the bad, and then they separate them into where they belong. If you've ever farmed or gardened, you know, you pull the weeds and you throw them in a pile. You get whatever produce you have and you put that in a pile. But this is what Jesus explains then in verses 37 through 39, this event and the importance of it. And he moves on then to teach the lesson of doctrine that this parable communicates. So now that we understand all those parts and we understand how they coordinate together, we can look at what Jesus says the message of the parable is. And so starting at verse 40 then, it says, just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. And so this is what Jesus says is the message of the parable then. He says in general, verse 40 I think is kind of a straightforward summary of what is going on. He says, in the same way that weeds are gathered and burned, it will be the same at the end of the age. And this parable then addresses this concept of the end of the age. I think it's important to note that Jesus speaks of two ages. We'll look at an example here. He speaks of two ages, the current age and then the future age, the one to come. And that is how, if you want to think of it in time, is divided. The current age and the age to come. And so an example of this, as is actually talked about in the previous chapter, and so we're familiar with this verse, whoever speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven, but whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven. And this is what I want you to pay attention to for the moment. Either in this age or the one to come. So it's divided into two. There is this age, and then there is the coming age. And this teaching occurs elsewhere also. For example, if you at some point want to look at Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 21, and talking about the authority and the power that is possessed by Jesus, it says, authority and power and dominion and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. And so Paul also continues that idea that there is a current age and a future age. And Jesus suggests by this parable that the separation of these two ages is this harvest event that he's talking about. Because this is at the end of the first age. The harvest happens then. And so then Jesus is describing in verses 40 through 43 what will happen at the end of the present age. If we look at verse 41, for instance, Christ will send his angels to gather out of his kingdom all those who practice or cause sin. And it would be interesting to spend more time talking about the fact that it says Jesus' angels and Jesus' kingdom, but we'll move on. And then in verse 42 it says, they will take those who are gathered up and throw them, the children of the evil one, into the fiery furnace, where he says there is suffering and weeping. And so we need to take a moment and say that this is one of the most direct teachings of Jesus on the concepts of judgment and hell. It is very direct. It is straightforward. And what Jesus says here is that there are two groups. Jesus says there are the children of the kingdom who will dwell with the Father. And then Jesus says that there are the children of the evil one who will dwell in the furnace of fire. And this is the reality of what the future holds, according to Jesus. But notice something important. Because before we start saying these people belong here and these people belong here, notice how the people are categorized into these groups. They're categorized as the children of the kingdom or the children of the evil one based on what they do. And so in verse 41, the Son of Man sends his angels, and they gather out of the kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers. So it's based on what they do. The stumbling blocks, those who break God's law, that is who the angels are gathering, based on what they do in this present age. So after the gathering, the children of God, the righteous, will be revealed and dwell in the kingdom of their Father, in verse 43. And that's connected back to the original parable where he says, but collect my wheat into my barn. It's dwelling in the place of the Father. So the children of the kingdom then will reflect the heavenly glory of the Father. This idea of radiance here. So instead of being hidden and mixed up in the field of the world, they will display the glory of God. There will be a separation, and it will be, these are the weeds, this is the wheat, and it will be clear who is who. And so the main point in all of that is that in the world of the kingdom, there will be good and bad people coexisting. And again, that is based on our responses and what we do. And the truth will be revealed at the end of this age when Jesus gathers people for judgment and God's purpose is then fulfilled. And so that's what Jesus is talking about and what he's driving at here. And the point is that all exist together now, but at some point God will separate people based on what they've done, and that is how have they responded to the kingdom under question. So that's the doctrine that Jesus is teaching, and that's what he wants us to understand as far as what we might sometimes say at the end times, or your $10 word for the day is eschatology. That's what Jesus is teaching here about those things. But even with that teaching, Did you notice that the questions posed in the original parable weren't actually answered? So go back to the actual parable when it is told in Matthew chapter 13, and that's again starting in verse 24. But if you look at this, in verse 26 it says, "So the plants came up and they bore grain, and then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came in and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?'" Didn't you do a good thing? Didn't you have a good plan? Why did it end up like this? And then the second question, after he says, "An enemy has done this," they say, "Well, do you want us to go and to gather the weeds?" And he just says, "No, so that you don't destroy both together." But it's not really told why that's the case. So I want to take a minute to examine these two questions because they present some applications for us. And aside from the doctrine that Jesus is teaching, I think they really get us kind of the application maybe of how we're supposed to incorporate this in our lives. And so we look at this first question, and we could say, did you not sow good seed? Why are there weeds here? Why is your crop not very good? So in the parable, the servants are questioning the master on the results of the work. They probably scattered the seed, but they said, "Did you buy garbage? Like, what is this? If everything was done according to your plan, shouldn't the results be better? Shouldn't it just be all wheat, and shouldn't there be no weeds there?" So the assumption here is that if the master's work was done right, then the field would consist only of these desirable plants. And so because there is the plants, but also the weeds, then there must be something deficient in what the master provided. And so accordingly, I think especially for the disciples then, but also for us today, we might look at the world, the field of God, and ask, if God's purposes are all accomplished, then why is there still all this evil? And why hasn't there been this complete takeover and establish of this new order that many of the disciples had been looking for? Because that's what the apostles were looking for at first. They were seeing that the Messiah was going to usher in this new age, and in that, he would literally take everything over, and all evil would be done away with, and he would establish his kingdom ruling physically on God's earth. But that didn't happen. We can also look at the world and wonder why things are the way that they are. There are still people doing bad things, and we live in the world and we have these negative experiences, and we get world weary and all of the things that go with that. But the only answer that's really given to this is that it's an enemy who's responsible for it. The enemy is the one who sowed the weeds in the field and trying to sabotage what it was that the master was doing. So that's the partial answer that we're given. And this flows really into the next question, and I'll spoil it. I think both have the same answer. And so the next question then is, well, do you want us to gather the weeds then? So seeing the weeds and understanding that there's been attack on the crop by the enemy, the diligent servants asked, well, do you want us to go and weed the field so that they won't choke out all of the crops? And again, the question assumes that there's a certain expectation of the way that things should be done. The master's crop should grow unhindered, and if there's any weeds, then obviously they should be pulled out. If you have a garden, you do that. You don't want the weeds in there because they can crowd out what it is that you're trying to grow. So obviously, we should go in there and get rid of these, right? And again, the question isn't exactly answered directly, but it is given an answer where he says, no. Don't gather the weeds right now, because if you do, you might hurt the crop too. This would probably be because, if you think about plants, the roots are all tangled up together. If they're growing together, the roots get intertwined. You try to pull one up, you're going to pull the other up. And so you have to wait until you can cut them all down and sort them out. They're intertangled. Their lives, their growing, and all of those things are intertwined. And so then taking it back to us, we might see the wrongdoing in the world and wonder why Jesus doesn't just stop all of it now. Why don't you just come and end the world and do what it was that you promised? Why doesn't he just have the harvest right now? And that's what the disciples have been wondering since this was first taught. What's revealed in response to these questions, again, not even really directly, but that there is an event in the future where there will be a harvest and this problem will be addressed. So ultimately, then, the answer to both these questions of why don't things look better and do you want us to do something about it, the answer to both questions is you need to wait and it's all going to work out. And that's not always satisfying because we do have those expectations in the way that we think things need to work. But in between the lines of this parable is that we might wonder what it is that God is doing. Why has he waited 2,000 years? Why are these things not happening when we think they should happen? Oh, it looks like maybe we're getting close, but then it doesn't happen. But he assures us that there is a plan, and he will accomplish it, but he's going to accomplish it in his time. And so the lesson for us in this parable is to be patient. To realize that there's going to be an end to this world as we know it. And that we won't have to live intertwined in this way forever. We need to be patient and wait for what has been promised. Because clearly, if you look at the responses of the master to the servants, the master knows a little bit more about what's going on. He sees the fuller picture and he knows why things are the way that they are, and he knows how they're going to end up. And that is what Jesus is talking about. In teaching this parable, Jesus addresses after the kingdom is established, there will be some outcomes and some situations that might raise some questions. He's saying this while he's still in ministry, so he's anticipating then that what happens is not going to line up to what we think was going to happen, especially the apostles. There will be some outcomes and some situations that might raise some questions, and things are going to be all mixed up because we still live in the world. We're still a part of the world in that way. But what he points out is that there will be a day when everything is sorted out. And so what we need to be doing is to be looking ahead and waiting. What we need to do is to look ahead and wait for when the master will bring his harvest in the way that he has promised. And then Jesus closes this teaching with the phrase, "Whoever has ears, let them hear." And we might say that you need to listen up because this is important. This matters. Jesus is giving a heads up and an explanation of the way that things are and why they are the way they are, but more importantly, of the way that things are going to be. He's giving us a heads up of how things are going to be. One day, Jesus reveals everyone is going to be gathered, but we will be separated based on what our response is to his kingdom. And so our question is kind of thinking about our call to action is what group will we be in? It's a simple question. What group will we be in? If you want to be planted and grown by Jesus as a child of God in the kingdom of the Father, that's what we want. That's what we're trying to do also. To grow in that field, to be found as that crop that then gets stored and living with the master. And if you want to be part of that, then we can help you to do it. You can walk with us on this road. Not that we have all the answers, but you can walk with us on this road and you can be in that group. If there's some way that we can help you tonight, then just let us know anytime while we're singing or after the service. But be thinking about that while we stand and sing.